Chairman, Mr. Thompson, first I want to say to the families that we continue to feel deeply about your loss. I have some questions for Mr. Thompson concerning the role of the Counter-terrorism Bureau. Now, Mr. Thompson, your lawyer said you were unwilling to talk with any Democratic member of this committee, so I've had to rely on statements that were made to the press. Your own statement is mostly biographical about the work you've done in Yemen and Latin America and the rest. Now, one report I found indicated that you believe that Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Patrick Kennedy, and here I'm quoting from this report, tried to cut the Counterterrorism Bureau out of the loop as they and other Obama administration officials weighed how to respond to and characterize the Benghazi attacks. Now, that's the end of that quote. Mr. Thompson, I'm asking you, is that quote accurate, that you believe that the Counterterrorism Bureau was intentionally kept out of the loop for political reasons?
It is not. I indicated that the portion of the Counterterrorism Bureau that responds to crises, i.e. part of the office, was pushed out of that discussion. The Counterterrorism Bureau was represented in subsequent meetings after the night of 9/11.
So, do you believe you were kept out for political reasons? This quote makes it...
I do not politicize my job, Madam. I have served under 3 presidents, starting with President Clinton up to the present. I've served 6 secretaries.
I've got to continue. Mr. Thompson, I was just quoting the quote. So the quote isn't entirely accurate then?
Correct.
All right. That's very important for the record. That Mr. Thompson is not saying that they were kept out of the loop for political reasons. This week, this quote apparently caused your former boss in the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department, I'm speaking now of Ambassador Daniel Benjamin, to issue a public statement disagreeing with this allegation in particular, which was in quotes. And he said, and I am now quoting him, "It has been alleged that the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau was cut out of the discussion and decision-making in the aftermath of the Benghazi attacks. I ran the Bureau then, and I can say with certainty that as the former coordinator for counterterrorism, that this charge is simply untrue." Do you agree with Ambassador Benjamin?
I agree that the Counterterrorism Bureau was included, but there's a distinction with a difference with respect to the portion of the Counterterrorism Bureau that would be most effective in the aftermath of an attack.
Now, all of this was under Ambassador Benjamin. He didn't say one portion or the other. You are yourself saying, although the Bureau was represented, somehow some portions of the Bureau were not represented. And how is that?
That's what happened, ma'am.
It says the Bureau, he says going on, was a central participant in the interagency discussion about the longer-term response to Benghazi. At no time was the Bureau sidelined or otherwise kept from carrying out its tasks. This seems to me to directly contradict your testimony here today. He says,
I respectfully disagree.
We were all in. You say, well, yeah, you were in, but somehow the other, some part of it was not in.
No other part of the Counterterrorism Bureau is responsible for responding to a crisis. This was a crisis. My office was not involved in those subsequent meetings. Other members of the office were very professional people, and I'm sure they did their best at those meetings.
Well, we certainly don't want to get involved in who down the chain of line gets consulted. But the ambassador says after the attack, the first question to arise that involved the Counterterrorism Bureau was whether or not the Foreign Emergency Support team should be deployed. The question of deployment was posed early, and the department decided against such a deployment. In my view, it was appropriate to pose the question, and the decision was a correct one. And now, were you aware that your superiors were consulted about the decision not to employ the Foreign Emergency Support Team?
You can go ahead and
as
answer,
earlier
you can go ahead and answer that, although the gentlelady's time has expired. Answer.
As earlier indicated, ma'am, I was told that by the Undersecretary of Management's office. The normal process for deploying the team is that at the Assistant Secretary level, at a counterterrorism security group at the White House, those options are discussed. At that convening of that CSG, that decision is recommended or not recommended to the Deputies Committee. It is not solely a State Department function or authority to launch the Foreign Emergency Support Team, even though we are one part of it.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hicks, when you arrived in July, did the facilities in Benghazi meet the minimum OSPB security standards set by the State Department?
According to the regional security officer at the time in Tripoli, John Martinek, they did not.
What about the facilities in Tripoli? The Benghazi facilities did not meet the minimum standards of the facilities in Tripoli?
Again, according to the regional security officer in Tripoli, John Martinek, they were very weak. Yes, they did not meet.
They did not meet. Do you think they were close to meeting the standards?
No, sir.
Mr. Nordstrom, before you left as the RSO, did the facilities have the number of security personnel that you had requested?
No, they did not.
Mr. Nordstrom, there are a very, very small number of facilities worldwide that are considered by GAO critical or high threat level for personnel serving in our different embassies and consulates. Tripoli and Benghazi, were they listed as critical or high threat level?
They were. That was something that I had put in my written testimony as well.
Correct. By statute, Mr. Nordstrom, who has the authority to place personnel in a facility that does not meet the minimum OSPB standards?
As I had noted in there, the OSPB standards go in tandem with SECA, which is Secure Embassy Construction, both of which derived out of the East Africa bombings, or were strengthened after that. It's my understanding that since we were the sole occupants of both of those facilities, Benghazi and Tripoli, the only person who could grant waivers or exceptions to those was the Secretary of State.
Mr. Hicks, there were a lot of concerns about him. There were a lot of security issues that Mr. Nordstrom has listed in numerous reports leading up to his trip there. Why was the ambassador headed there?
According to Chris, Secretary Clinton wanted Benghazi converted into a permanent constituent post. Timing for this decision was important. Chris needed to report before September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, on the physical and the political and security environment in Benghazi to support an action memo to convert Benghazi from a temporary facility to a permanent facility. In addition, Chris wanted to make a symbolic gesture to the people of Benghazi that the United States stood behind their dream of establishing a new democracy.
Why was this timing important? Was it significant that he went right now? Was there some hesitation about him going at that moment for that length of time? Could he have waited a couple more months to be able to go?
He had originally planned to go to Benghazi in October, but we had a 2-week gap in the principal officer position. Eric Gaudiosi was departed on August 31st, and his replacement was not due in the country until September 15th. We covered the initial 10-day period with David McFarland, and then the ambassador chose to go. And again, he chose to go for those reasons.
What was the timeline on trying to make this a permanent facility, or was there anything pending that had to be accomplished by a certain deadline?
We had funds available that could be transferred from an account set aside for Iraq and could be dedicated to this purpose. They had to be obligated by September 30th.
Okay. And where did those instructions come from?
This came from the executive office of the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs.
So they were told to go ahead and check everything out, get the process going in Benghazi because we had to do it and we had to do it right now. He planned to go in October, but said we've got to get there earlier and get this started in. Plus, there was an opening as well of the principal officer.
That's right.
Mr. Nordstrom, on March the 28th, there's a cable that you sent to Washington requesting to keep the diplomatic security that you already had on the ground, that level of security, and not have that level of security decreased. Did you draft that cable?
I did.
Who was the intended recipient of that cable?
Generally, those types of requests would go to our diplomatic security personnel. Certainly, DAS Charlene Lamb, who was with me before in October, testified, and certainly to Undersecretary of Management and Near Eastern Affairs would typically be the distribution for that.
Okay, thank you. My time is expired.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hicks, let me start by acknowledging how riveting your testimony was of the events of that day and evening, and thanking you for your service and your activity, for sharing with us all the brave acts that occurred that night. I don't think we've heard enough of that. And I think it's important for the American people to know how many individuals, both in Tripoli and in Libya, responded so very well and bravely on that. So thank you for sharing that and for your service as well. We have an important responsibility here, and that is to ensure that whatever happened that night and whatever we learned from what could have been done better actually gets fixed. And I think that's a legitimate process for this committee to do. I hope we move on that basis. I know that we had accountability review boards set up immediately in the wake of all of this, and they were rather harsh in the determination on that. And in fact, they made some 29 different recommendations on that, and we should be finding out whether or not the Secretary of State and the Department are implementing those recommendations and how expeditiously. And I hope that at some point we can get to that, which I think would be the appropriate role for the government. And I know that two of the three witnesses here this morning actually spoke with the Accountability Review Board, and the third certainly knew of his right to speak and chose not to contact them for whatever reason on that. But earlier this week, I think disturbingly, the chairman went on to national television and actually accused the administration of deliberately misleading the American people about the attacks in Benghazi. For somebody that's earned the term of being a whopper, making a statement of a whopper and 4 Pinocchios, it's a little bit shocking to think that kind of a statement would be made without any apparent backup. The basis for the extreme charge were apparently statements made by Ambassador Rice on news shows the Sunday after the attacks. And the comments were allegedly that talking points were provided by the intelligence community were supposedly manipulated for political purposes. What was quoted by the chairman at that TV show is, "Clearly the American public was deliberately misled," said the whopper, and it was a political decision, close quote. Mr. Hicks, you told our investigators that you weren't involved with the drafting of those talking points, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Mr. Nordstrom, you weren't involved either, is that correct?
No, I was not.
And Mr. Thompson, you also were not involved, is that right?
Yes, Congressman, but however, I offered my services to the ARB, and I did not try to keep myself out of that process, just for the record.
Good, thank you. And we know that there were conflicting reports about what happened, including a statement by a Libyan official that there had been a demonstration and some eyewitness accounts of that protest. But Mr. Hicks, we know that you didn't believe that there was a protest. You believed that it was otherwise. And we know that the president of Libya also contradicted with that statement on that. But the intelligence community insisted it received initial reporting suggesting there was a demonstration. We know that the reporting was wrong. Now we know that. But the mention of a demonstration was put into talking points by the intelligence committee, not the White House or the State Department. So I want to play a little video here, if we can, of General Clapper, where he specifically addresses the attacks on Ambassador Rice. We have that queued up.
And when she was highly criticized for following them, what was your feeling inside? Your own personal belief. Did you think it was fair that she be criticized?
Well, I thought it was unfair because the hits she took, I didn't think that was appropriate, and she was going on what we had given her, and that was our collective best judgment at the time as to what should have been said.
Thank you.
So, General Clapper says that he thinks the attacks on Ambassador Rice were unfair. She was using exactly what the intelligence community gave her. Mr. Hicks, do you have an argument with his veracity when he made those statements?
There was no report from the U.S. mission in Libya of a demonstration.
The difficult question I have for you, because you're good enough to come forward, is do you contest the General Clapper's veracity? Is he lying, or is he telling the truth of what information he gave Ambassador Rice?
I don't know anything about the development of those talking points.
So, look, we haven't investigated this issue yet. It'd be interesting to know, but the House Intelligence Committee has. They got all of the draft talking points. They got the briefings and testimony from CIA officials. According to Adam Schiff, one of the representatives that's on and part of that investigation, he said, I quote, General Petraeus, the former head of the CIA, made it clear that the change was made to protect classified sources of information, not to spin it, not to politicize it, and it wasn't done at the direction of the White House. And we might, as an aside, we might be interested in protecting classified information because we've had situations where people in the majority have gone to Libya and come back and had a real flare-up about what they disclosed concerning classified information. But in addition, there was a bipartisan report issued by Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins that similarly stated, and I quote, no changes were made for political reasons, and there was no attempt to mislead the American people about what happened in Benghazi. So people who have actually seen the documents, who have actually conducted a real investigation, completely reject the allegation that they were made for political purposes or to deliberately mislead the American people. With that, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Tierney. Let me yield now to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hicks, in your 22 years of service to our country, you've always received good reviews, strong evaluations. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
And as I look, I'm just a country boy from Ohio, but as I look at your resume and bio, other than the degrees from Michigan, it's impressive. It's amazing the things you have done. And in fact, immediately after the attacks, everybody said you did a great job. Right? You look at the addendum here. Wendy Sherman said you did an outstanding job. Bill Burns, Deputy Secretary of State, great work, heroic efforts. You got a phone. Isn't it true, Mr. Hicks? I think you cited this in your opening statement. The Secretary Clinton gave you a call immediately after the attacks and said you did an outstanding job under extreme circumstances?
Yes, sir. We had the first call at 2 a.m. and then again a video conference with our staff.
And isn't it also true the President of the United States called you up and said, you know what, Mr. Hicks, you did an outstanding job again under severe circumstances?
He did call me, sir.
And all that seems to change. You're getting all this praise and support, but all that seems to change, and it seems to change in the phone call you were on that Mr. Gowdy referenced in his questioning, the phone call you got from Beth Jones. Is that accurate?
Yes, at a phone call after the interview, I asked...
This is after Secretary Rice has went on television and misled the American people. You're on a phone call with Beth Jones, and it all seems to change then because you asked Beth Jones what?
I asked her why the ambassador had said there was a demonstration when the embassy had reported only an attack.
And again, what kind of response did you get from Beth Jones when you asked that question?
She said, I don't know.
Was it like you shouldn't be asking that question? You should be quiet. We don't want to talk about that. What was the sense you got?
The sense I got was that I needed to stop the line of questioning.
And did things continue to deteriorate between you and your superiors? After they've given you all this praise, you've had this outstanding service record, 22 years serving our country, things began to deteriorate even more. And as I read the transcript, it seems to me that it came to a head in phone calls you were on with lawyers from the Department of State prior to Congressman Chaffetz coming to visit in Libya. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about those conversations, what those lawyers instructed you to do on Mr. Chaffetz's visit to Libya.
I was instructed not to allow the RSO, the acting deputy chief of mission, and myself to be personally interviewed by Congressman Chaffetz.
So the people at State told you don't talk to the guy who's coming to investigate?
Yes, sir.
Said don't talk with the congressman? Now you've had several congressional delegations come to various places you've been around the world. Has that ever happened where lawyers get on the phone to you prior to a congressional delegation coming to investigate a time when we've had 4 Americans lose their lives? Have you ever had anyone tell you, don't talk with the people from Congress coming to find out what took place?
Never.
Never. And you've had dozens and dozens of congressional delegations that you've been a part of.
Yes, sir.
First time it's ever happened.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about, and also, isn't it true that one of those lawyers on the phone call accompanied the folks on the delegation and tried to be in every single meeting you had with Mr. Chaffetz and the delegation from this committee?
Yes, sir. That's true.
Tell me what happened when you got a classified briefing with Mr. Chaffetz. What happened and the phone call that happened after that?
The lawyer was excluded from the meeting because his clearance was not high enough, and the delegation had insisted that the briefing not be limited by any.
Did the lawyer try to get in that briefing?
He tried, yes, but the annex chief and would not allow it because the briefing needed to be at the appropriate level of clearance.
And you had a subsequent conversation after this classified briefing that the lawyer was not allowed to be in, with you and Mr. Chaffetz and others on that delegation. And you had another conversation on the phone with Cheryl Mills. Tell me, who is Cheryl Mills?
She was counselor for the Department of State and chief of staff to Secretary Clinton.
That's a pretty important position.
Yes, sir.
When she calls, you take the phone call?
Immediately.
Yeah, she's the fixer for the Secretary of State. She is as close as you can get to Secretary Clinton. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about that phone call you had with Cheryl Mills.
A phone call from that senior person is, generally speaking, not considered to be good news.
And what did she have to say to you?
She demanded a report on the visit.
Was she upset by the fact that this lawyer was
was upset.
Babysitter, this spy, whatever you want to call him, was not allowed to be in that? First time it's ever happened. All the congressional delegations you've ever entertained was not allowed to be in that classified briefing. Was she upset about that fact?
She was very upset.
So this goes right to the person next to Secretary Clinton. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, here's a guy with 22 years of outstanding service to our country. 22 years. Outstanding service, praised by everybody who counts. The president, the secretary, everyone above him. And yet now they're obstructing it because he won't help them cover this up. He's an honorable man here telling the truth. Now is getting this kind of treatment from the very people who praised him before. This is why this hearing is so important. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Pleased to yield.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. You know, the Accountability Review Board made a number of recommendations to better strengthen overseas embassies and missions like the one in Benghazi. Mr. Nordstrom, you told our staff that you read the ARB's unclassified report and recommendations. Do you think that implementing these recommendations is important to ensure the safety and security of our foreign service?
Absolutely. I had an opportunity to review that along with the other two committee reports. I think taken all together, they're fairly comprehensive and reasonable.
And I guess a diplomat like you probably feels very disheartened when you read in the paper, say you're overseas, that Congress has cut this budget for embassy security, and Congress has been cheap, on the cheap, providing protection to our personnel. You know, in order to make security possible at our missions and our embassies throughout the world, it's one recommendation in this report that attempts to grapple with these issues and err on the side of increased attention to prioritization and the fuller support for people and facilities engaged in working in high-risk, high-threat areas. The solution requires a more serious and sustained commitment from Congress to support State Department needs, which in total constitute a small percentage both of the full national budget and that spent for national security. But it's exactly what we in Congress have failed to do in the past. Let's look at our record. House Republicans voted to cut the administration's request for embassy security funding by 128 million. And that was in fiscal year 2011. In fiscal year 2012, they cut the request by even more, providing $331 million less than requested. You know, our Republican counterparts have just said that these cuts are based on their priorities and choices. And when asked whether he voted to cut diplomatic security by over $300 million on CNN, Representative Chaffetz responded, absolutely. Look, we have to make priorities and choices in this country. But these cuts have impacts, serious impacts. And I want you to know that my priorities, including funding these recommendations, which will save lives. You know, the ARB, Mr. Nordstrom, just to be clear, you provided information to the ARB, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And Mr. Hicks, is it true that you also provided information?
The ARB interviewed,
ARB,
yes.
you know, it was led by Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen, who happens to be the former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. In its investigation, the review board interviewed more than 100 people, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, and viewed hours of videotapes. The board made 29 recommendations to improve security systems and procedures to prevent future deadly attacks. And a key finding made by the board related to availability of funding, is specifically for temporary facilities in high-risk, high-threat environments. And the board stated, the department should develop minimum security standards for occupancy of temporary facilities in high-risk, high-threat environments and seek greater flexibility for the use of Bureau of Overseas Buildings Operations sources of funding so that they can be rapidly made available for security upgrades at such facilities. And it is important to note that the facility in Benghazi was designated as a temporary facility. Mr. Nordstrom, do you agree with the board's review?
That was actually one of the specific things that I talked with the board. My concern is there is no such thing when you look at the FAM or the OSPB standards for a temporary facility. And so by its very nature...
So they developed the recommendation.
After the fact.
How about you, Mr. Hicks? Do you agree with the recommendation?
I'm not a security expert. I'm a diplomat. I'm an economic officer. But I support every improvement that can possibly be made to improve our security overseas, including increasing the training of our personnel.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman. I would also thank the gentleman from Missouri, but ask, were you here on October 10th when the person who had those requests for additional security said money was not a factor, Charlene Lamb? Do you remember her?
I can't remember if I was at this.
So, Mr. Nordstrom, you were on that panel. Do you remember what she said?
Yes, she said that resources was not an issue, and I think I would also point to the ARB report, if I'm not mistaken, that they talked to our chief financial officer with DS, who also said that resources were not an issue. So.
Mr. Chairman, the ARB says resources were an issue.
Well, I guess the question that I have about the ARB, and again, it's not what the ARB has, is what it doesn't have, and that it stops short of the very people that need to be asked those questions, and that's the Undersecretary of Management and above. Those are perfect questions that he needs.
And I'm sure that if we implement some of the recommendations, it will help us prevent a future attack.
And I appreciate that. And what I would say is that in the earlier hearing in October 10th, the one thing we did discover is, yes, this facility was not able to take the blows even of a small bomb that had gone off earlier. Mr. Nordstrom testified to the fact that this consulate, temporary consulate, had been attacked twice, and they'd breached the wall. So there was an awful lot of recognition that it was an insufficient facility, and I think that's ARB, no ARB, that's something that's well in the committee's record, but I thank you for bringing it out.
Thank you.
We now go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I have to
again tell the families that we will continue to pursue this, and all the facts need to be known about what took place and hold people accountable. And then next to the witnesses, thank you for your service. Thank you for your bravery in actually coming forward. And again, some of the commendable acts of the State Department employees you described. As everybody may know, and I follow up really on my colleague Mr. Clay's question about the report there, Accountability Review Board report, and this is the unclassified version. There's a classified version also. This is available online. And we have a responsibility under law to review these situations and to go to people who actually had firsthand knowledge. Now, Mr. Thompson, you have a very important position. The title is Bureau of Counter-terrorism and Leader, Foreign Emergency Support Team, U.S. Department of State, right?
Correct.
Okay, and did you participate? Were you interviewed by the ARB?
I was not.
You were not interviewed, okay. And you were on the job during this period?
I was at my desk that night till 2 o'clock in the morning.
And you were not allowed to convey information to the board?
On the 17th, I conveyed my request to be interviewed before the board.
And so they did interview you after that?
No.
Have you ever been interviewed?
I have not.
You have not. So you're one of the primary players, but yet the board failed to interview. Would you say that's correct?
That is a correct statement.
Mr. Thompson, is he an important player? I'm sorry, Mr. Hicks, is Mr. Thompson an important player in this, Mr. Nordstrom?
I would say yes,
Okay.
certainly in the aftermath of the attack.
Okay, let me go to Charge Hicks. Were you interviewed by the board?
I was interviewed by the board.
Were you able to convey all the information that you felt was necessary regarding this incident to the board?
The interview took about 2 hours, and it was, in my mind, incomplete. A few days later, I had a separate meeting briefly with the executive secretary.
So you did have a follow-up meeting, and you expressed that...
With the board's executive secretary to amplify on some issues that had been discussed at the meeting, at the initial interview.
And Mr. Nordstrom, did you participate?
I did on 2 occasions. I also shared with them
Could you
a
share
luminous
how
amount
that
of
process worked? We heard from Mr. Hicks.
Sure. Is this similar?
Was it thorough?
I felt it was thorough and professional. As I said, the report, and as I've held, the report is fairly thorough and comprehensive. My issue is that they stopped short of interviewing people that I personally know were involved in key decisions that led to how those events unfolded.
Well,
specifically, how those buildings were staffed and constructed and in variance with existing standards. Those are all critical to the...
They fell short. Well, in the unclassified version, they said security in Benghazi was not recognized and implemented as a shared responsibility by the bureaus in Washington charged with supporting the post, resulting in stovepipe decisions on policy and security. Now, the next part is interesting. That being said, Embassy Tripoli did not demonstrate strong and sustained advocacy with Washington for increased security for Special Mission Benghazi. Would you both agree with it?
If I could speak to that, I would disagree that it was a collaborative process. I'm not sure exactly the term they used. On a number of occasions, I testified in October as well. I raised issues, others raised issues, the ambassador raised issues, the DCM raised issues, to the point where reports and decisions on both the Tripoli compound and the Benghazi compound were decided in Washington, and those decisions were not either cleared with us or shared with us.
They were our very best. I don't want that part to be overlooked. These individuals were regarded as our very best, including Ambassador Stevens, without question. I think his opinion and the respect that his experience and authority in matters, all matters in Lebanon, Libya, and not only in Tripoli but also in Benghazi was unquestioned, I think. And it showed in the deference that others gave him to those decisions. I thought the ARB report especially did single out some areas where I thought they were trying to identify where the decisions that were made may have been deficient. And they do identify at page 30, they talk about the Bureau of Diplomatic Security and NEA, the Near Eastern Affairs, and at Post, there appeared to be a very real confusion over who ultimately was responsible and empowered to make decisions based on policy and security considerations. They go on further to say the DS Bureau showed a lack of proactive senior leadership with respect to Benghazi, failing to ensure that the priority security needs of a high-risk, high-threat post were met. And at the same time, with the tension in late 2011 shifting to a growing crisis in Egypt and Syria, the NEA Bureau's front office showed a lack of ownership of Benghazi's security issues and a tendency to rely totally on diplomatic security for the latter. The board also found that Embassy Tripoli leadership, saddled with their own staffing and security challenges, did not single out a special need for increased security for Benghazi. Now, what they point to in the next couple of paragraphs is they thought that the result, that the special mission Benghazi extension, that this was a temporary residential facility not officially notified to the host government, even though it was also a full-time office facility, resulted in the special mission compound being accepted from office facility standards and accountability under Secure Embassy Construction and Counter-terrorism Act of 1999. Mr. Nordstrom, your point exactly. And the Overseas Security Policy Board, OSPB. So what they're saying is because there was an extension made, that there was a lowering in expectation there, that the resources for physical security and also the personnel assignments needed at that was not given an adequate priority, and that it was left to diplomatic security in some cases to make those repairs. Is that something that you see as being a weak point in this whole process that allowed Benghazi to be ill-prepared for the attacks on September 11th?
I do. As I said, I think that what still remains unseen is who made that decision to go ahead and assume that this is going to be a temporary facility. At one point, in fact, I was told by by colleagues in OBO and DS that the recommendations that we wanted to make, the upgrades, both in Tripoli and Benghazi, would not be made. They forwarded us the way forward documents that we discussed in October. And they said, and I quote, "It's my understanding that M, Undersecretary for Management, agreed to the current compounds being set up in occupied condition as is." The ARB in particular found it interesting at my reply, which was in February of 2013. I requested, "Is anything in writing? If so, I'd like a copy for post so we have it handy for the ARB." That's 8 months before the attack.
Right.
I got no confirmation as to who made those decisions, nor did I get a copy of that.
And so the status was still in limbo at that point. I know there was some discussions with Mr. Langford earlier, the gentleman from Oklahoma, that
My understanding was the facility, again, the types of facilities are whether or not you're sole occupancy of the building, or are you a partial occupancy of, say, a commercial building, or if you are in a building which is owned by the host nation. Well, clearly we were the sole occupant, and that's the standards. It's very clear, and it's based on our threat and those standards. We did not meet any of those standards, with the exception of perhaps the height of the wall.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
I thank you. Just one thing. You used the term M for the Undersecretary for Management. Who was that?
At the time and throughout all of this was Patrick Kennedy, who was up here in October as well.
So that's who would have been the person who said no, or this is good enough, presumably.
Presumably, again, I don't know what the decisions, the factors were in his decision. I'm sure he had reasons for those decisions. I'm not going to criticize those. My only concern is that nobody has looked at those, whether it be the ARB or anybody else.
Thank you. Mr. Turner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here today. Without your statements, there is a tremendous amount of information that we just wouldn't know. And certainly it's important that you're giving us this information, as we all have deep condolences for the families. As we look at the information that we've gotten today, we basically have two stand-down decisions that we've been able to discuss. One, the foreign emergency support team that Mr. Thompson has told us about, and Mr. Hicks, you told us of Colonel Gibson. Mr. Hicks, I'm a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I'm very fascinated with the stand-down order to Colonel Gibson. As we pursue that, we want to know who gave Colonel Gibson the order and why. And so I would like to review that stand-down order with you and what you experienced that night, since you were with him as he was receiving that stand-down order. You told us that there was a C-130 Libyan transport that had been provided, and that you had indicated to Colonel Gibson that he should go to reinforce Benghazi and help the withdrawal personnel. Colonel Gibson was told to stand down, and that plane left without him, landing about 7:30 in Benghazi without Colonel Gibson's team. So let's start first with the review of what is Colonel Gibson's team. What were those personnel, Colonel Gibson's team? What were they doing in Libya?
They are the remaining members of the special security team, this group of 16 or 14 special forces personnel assigned to protect Embassy Tripoli after the return and reestablishment of the embassy in September of 2011. And on the 1st of August, the Secretary of Defense signed an order changing their status from being a security team to a training team and transferring their authority from the Chief of Mission, the ambassador, to General Ham. On August 6th, two members of that team were in a carjacking incident as they were driving early in the morning outside the compound, and they had to use their weapons in order to escape that armed attack on their vehicle. In light of that incident, General Ham decided to draw down the team from 14 personnel to 4 personnel, and Lieutenant Colonel Wood and 9 others, Lieutenant Colonel Wood testified before this committee last October, left Tripoli in the middle of the month. So the Lieutenant Colonel Gibson and the other 3 members of that team are the remainder of that group.
So their chain of command had been changed and they had been reduced. But as you were just describing, these are highly trained individuals with specialized skills that would have been useful in the situation in Benghazi.
Yes, absolutely, and particularly given the fact, again, that the personnel in Benghazi were exhausted from a night of fighting against very capable opponents.
Now, do you know why they were told to stand down? Colonel Gibson give you any information or understanding of?
I actually don't know why.
Is there any reason to believe that the situation in Benghazi was over? I mean, there were a number of series of attacks that you've described to us. Any reason to believe that that there was no longer any danger in Benghazi?
No, it was every reason to continue to believe that our personnel were in danger.
Mr. Chase has given me an article that appeared in USA Today just this week, and just as early as last Monday, Major Robert Furman, a Pentagon spokesman, said that the military's account that was first issued weeks after the attack hasn't changed. There was never any kind of stand-down order to anybody. Now, that's a pretty broad statement, anybody. What's your reaction to the quote by Mr. Furman?
I can only, again, repeat that Lieutenant Colonel Gibson said he was not to proceed to board the airplane.
So your first-hand experience being on the site, standing next to Colonel Gibson, who was on his way on that C-130 transport, and being told not to go, contradicts what Mr. Furman is saying on behalf of the Pentagon.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hicks, did the embassy have a defense attaché on staff whose role it was to interface with the Defense Department? And did you ask him at that evening, were there any resources coming from the U.S. Military? And what was your reaction to his responses as the evening unfolded?
My reaction was that, okay, we're on our own. We're going to have to try to pull this off with the resources that we have available.
Were the Libyans surprised?
I don't know, but I think they were.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before we go to Mr. Connolly, just because most people in the audience, including on the dais, don't understand Chief of Mission authority, would you, as Chief of Mission, run us through who was under your Chief of Mission authority and who wasn't? In other words, who did you have command and control of? And we're talking about military assets, because I think a lot of folks up here are hearing two chains of command, and it'd be helpful for you to explain it as a career State Department person quickly.
All civilian civilian USG personnel in Libya were under Chief of Mission authority, which was
yours
until we knew that he was dead, and then that passed to me. The 4 members of the Special Forces team were under General Ham's authority. We had 2 other military Special Forces personnel in country, and I was at that time unclear as to whether they were under my authority or not.
So anyone you had under your authority, you gave orders to, they responded, they went down range if you asked them to. The others were not allowed to.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly, thank you very much. You'll have your full time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the clarification. By the way, there have been some statements that Undersecretary Kennedy was not interviewed by the ARB by Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen. That is a misstatement fact. He most certainly was. You can look it up. It's documented. He was interviewed, and he provided evidence, and that evidence was evaluated. So it is simply not true that Undersecretary Kennedy was not part of that process. He most certainly was. And I'd ask, Mr. Chairman, the record so reflect.
Who said he wasn't? I'm not sure.
I think we've heard it from the table. Mr. Thompson, statements have been attributed to you that your bureau, the Counter-terrorism Bureau, was actually deliberately kept out of post-Benghazi developments, decision-making, and so forth. Are those statements attributed to you accurate?
It's true that my portion of this office was not participant.
Your portion. To whom did you report?
I report to Dan Benjamin at the time.
And did Mr. Benjamin, was he included in
He was overseas at the time.
He was overseas, but was he kept informed and involved?
I kept him informed in the early stages of...
Was he kept informed and involved by the Secretary's office?
I have no idea.
Would it surprise you to learn that he has stated emphatically that he most certainly was?
Wouldn't be a surprise. I've read it.
And would it surprise you that he contradicts your statements or statements attributed to you? And I read to you, this charge that we were kept out of the loop in the aftermath is simply untrue. Though I was out of the country on official travel at the time of the attack, I was in frequent contact with the department. At no time did I feel the Bureau was in any way being left out of deliberations that it should have been part of, unquote.
I would disagree. He's true factually. He is his view of how much of the Bureau was.
So for the record,
if I may, sir, if he thinks he was adequately informed and given counsel on that, then that is his professional.
Well, he's the head of the Bureau, and he's, in fact, was your supervisor, and that's his testimony. So it contradicts you.
I don't think it's his testimony, sir.
Well, I'm entering it into the record, so it's now on the evidentiary record. And
with the gentleman,
we could no, I will, Mr. Chairman.
I'll hold the time.
Okay, certainly.
Mr. Cummings, perhaps you were here, perhaps not, has said among a lot of people that we want to bring before this committee, he is now an anticipated future witness, so he can give testimony.
The chairman anticipated exactly the point I was going to make, so we can clear that up by having Mr. Benjamin here. Thank you. Mr. Hicks, I don't think anyone who could have listened to your account, the minute-by-minute account of what happened, could be anything but moved. The trauma of what you and your colleagues must have gone through, especially being in Tripoli, not being able physically to sort of reach out and do something about Benghazi, I think all of us can relate to that. Terrible. I was in Libya and Tripoli in May of last year before the tragedy, and I don't remember whether we had a chance to meet or not, but David Dreyer led our CODEL. We were not allowed to stay in Libya overnight. What struck me when I arrived in Tripoli was that airport security was provided by a militia. And, you know, I've traveled a lot over my years in foreign policy, and, you know, what goes through the mind is what could go wrong with this. It's a volatile, violent, unstable, or was, situation. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the domestic situation in Libya as we found it? Because I think sometimes that gets forgotten in the retelling that we're facing instability in Libya still in a post-Gaddafi revolutionary situation, and likewise in Benghazi. Could you just share with us some insights into what you found in terms of that inherent instability?
Thank you, Mr. Connolly, and thank you for being my representative. First of all, I just want to say that I don't recall saying that anyone other than myself testified to the ARB or was a witness before the ARB. So I wanted to be clear about that. The second thing is the political and security climate in Libya at the time. It was highly unstable, although after the elections, we thought that the political trajectory, the elections in July, we thought the political trajectory was heading in the right direction. President Magariaf had been selected. They were trying to appoint a new prime minister and move towards a democratic government. The security scene, however, was very unstable and has been, I think, well documented. You had assassinations and car bombings in Benghazi, but the assessment was that this was Libyan on Libyan and not necessarily directed at foreigners. At the same time that we are in the process of building towards making our post in Benghazi a permanent post, the British are contemplating returning there to Benghazi. They left after their ambassador survived an assassination attempt in June. In Tripoli, we also have instability. We have car bombings, carjackings. We have Islamic extremist militias that begin to attack Sufi shrines, and a government that is struggling to maintain security and improve security in the country.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, if I could just say to my constituent, we're proud of you, and I would add my voice to that of Mr. Cummings. I'm a member of not only this committee but the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and you have my personal pledge that were there ever to be any hint at retaliation or retribution for your willingness to come forth and tell your version of what happened, this member of Congress will intervene on your behalf forcefully.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, thank you for calling this hearing. There's obviously great interest in and concern about what happened in this tragic incident. Mr. Nordstrom, we've already heard Mr. Thompson say that he was never interviewed, even though he requested to be interviewed. Did I understand you correctly to say a few minutes ago that you know of other witnesses that had firsthand knowledge who were not interviewed by the board?
No, I don't believe I did that.
I guess I misunderstood about that, but I will tell you, though, I was a criminal court judge for 7.5 years trying felony criminal cases, and I can tell you that it's surprising that anybody with firsthand knowledge wouldn't be interviewed about this unless somebody did not want to have a complete report. Mr. Thompson, what were you told was the reason you were not interviewed?
I was not given a reason, sir.
You were not given a reason. Mr. Hicks, do you feel that the report lets any individual or bureaucracy off the hook?
Yes, sir. I think that in our system of government, the decision-making authority is at the level of presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed individuals. That's at the level of assistant secretary or higher. Now, the reporting coming out of Embassy Tripoli on conditions there, particularly the fact that we had to provide a daily report of who was in country to Undersecretary Kennedy, and the fact that he made the decision as to who came to Tripoli and Benghazi or who didn't, that budgets came to his table, and that security threat environment reports also came to his table, would suggest that there is some responsibility there.
Mr. Thompson, let me ask you this. Another thing I find surprising is that do the security people not consider the date of 9/11 to be? We've already heard somebody say that this mission was considered to be a high threat or a high risk mission. Do they not realize that 9/11 is a high security type date, and they should be prepared for terrorist activities on that date in particular?
Certainly. When I hear security, I think of Greg Nordstrom, so I won't go down the security trail too far here, but certainly on the anniversary of 9/11, since 9/11 2001, we have all had our antenna up, so to speak, and been forward leaning, if not physically, mentally on that particular day, yes.
The report basically puts primary blame for this situation on the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. I would like to ask if any of you have a comment about that. Do you think that's fair?
If I could,
yes, Mr.
And maybe this might also address Congressman Connolly's question. Well, my concern with the report is not that Undersecretary Kennedy was or was not interviewed. I don't know who was interviewed. Again, that's part of the confidentiality of it. But there's been a lot of discussion of how many people were supposed to be there or not supposed to be there. Those things are not driven by regulations and law. That's a subjective opinion. Obviously, that was quite a bit of my testimony in October. I go back to who authorized embassy employees, U.S. government employees, to go into facilities that did not meet legal requirements. I don't know who made that decision. And the reason why is because, as Ambassador Pickering said, he has decided to fix responsibility on the assistant secretary level and below. How I see that is, that's fine. It's an accountability of mid-level officer review board. And the message to my colleagues is that if you're above a certain level, no matter what your decision is, no one's going to question it. And that's my concern with the ARB.
Mr. Hicks, did you find other shortcomings in the report?
Well, I find shortcomings in the process.
In the process.
Although I was interviewed for 2 hours, I was never allowed to review the recording of my testimony to the board. I was never given an opportunity to read the unclassified report before it was published to see if my testimony had been incorporated or properly, at all or properly. And I have never been given an opportunity to read the classified report.
All right. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I must admit, one of the rules of this committee is that interviews and depositions, the witness actually gets a copy of and is allowed to make corrections in most cases to make sure that they didn't misstate something. So that is a little surprising to me. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, it's ironic that you said that, Mr. Chairman, since Mr. Thompson would not even engage with the Democratic side of the aisle in terms of answering any series of questions. But let me first of all say to the family members, we lost extraordinary servants to this country. You lost loved ones. And there's nothing that we can say that will ever heal your huge loss. But know that we will do everything in our power to make sure that other families do not go through what you're going through. To you, Mr. Hicks, thank you for your extraordinary service. As you were retelling the events, and they were harrowing, it reminded me of an experience that I had similar, in a foreign country, ambushed, and a sense that we were woefully underprotected. And I think as part of what we're going to glean from this today is that we have got to do a much better job of providing protection in high-risk, high-threat embassies and consul offices around the world. It was inadequate, and I'm troubled by the fact that General Ham withdrew additional support because they had been engaged in a carjacking. If anything, that would heighten our concern and we would create more support. Let me, though, ask you a question. You said earlier today that the lawyers at state told you not to talk to Mr. Chaffetz when he came. That's what I wrote down. And would you just verify that that's what you said?
We were not to be personally interviewed by Congressman Chaffetz.
Now, in your interview with the committee, you were asked the question, excuse me, did you receive any direction about information that Congressman Chaffetz shouldn't be given from Washington? And your answer was, no, I did not. Is that still your testimony today?
I don't recall that phrase, and
well,
then I thought that I said, and I'd have to review again, that I did receive instructions exactly as I said them, but I did not know who gave them to me because I did not have, at that time, have access to my email from my time as DCM in Tripoli.
If the gentlelady could just tell us what page of the transcript that's on.
Maybe the staff can get it for me. I'm reading from a separate
thank you.
Document. You did say that you were told to make sure other State Department officials were present for meetings with Representative Chaffetz. As you stated, they told me not to be isolated with Congressman Chaffetz. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I mean by not to have a personal interview with Congressman Chaffetz.
Okay, so it was more about not being in a situation where you did not have other people with you. Is that correct? As opposed to not being interviewed.
And again, that's what I said. Not to have not to be personally interviewed by Congressman Chaffetz.
It said, well, you said they told me not to be isolated with Congressman Chaffetz.
That's the meaning of isolated, not to be personally interviewed.
There was a classified briefing for Mr. Chaffetz that no other State Department official was able to attend, and you testified earlier. So, as a result, no other State Department officials can confirm what was said if there was a mischaracterization after the fact. So when Representative Chaffetz returned to Washington and attended this committee's hearing in October, there was a great deal of controversy about his description of that classified briefing. Did you by chance watch the hearing?
Actually, I didn't, but I don't think I said that no State Department official was allowed in that annex briefing. In fact, I was in that briefing, David McFarland was in that briefing, and the RSO John Martinick was in.
The attorney was not.
The attorney was excluded by the annex chief for clearance purposes.
Okay, when you received a call from Cheryl Mills, actually, let me ask you a different question.
The gentlelady's time has expired, but go ahead and ask your last question quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you deserve to have a post in a location that you desire. So I would like to ask you, where would you like to be posted?
The Court of King James is out of the question.
The country I would most like to go to, is that the question
Yes.
that you're and be assigned to? You know, I'd really want to talk to my decision maker, chief decision maker in my family, who's sitting right over here, my wife, because I think her opinion is more important than mine on that point.
And so, to conclude, Mr. Chairman, I believe
He really is a diplomat, Ms. Pierce.
well, most of you should be diplomats on issues like that. Ms. Dibble has said to you that she would help you get a good onward assignment. And I think this committee will help you get a good onward assignment. So we await your, the responsible person for that decision informing us.
I thank the gentlelady, and I'm actually shocked that Mr. Connolly didn't make that a promise to a constituent who could vote. And with that, we go to the representative from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Not to bring the subject matter of this hearing back to the subject matter of this hearing, but I'm sorry, Mr. Hicks. The Senate is in charge of those types of movements of our ambassadors in the confirmation process. But I hear there's a wide variety of islands just to the south of Florida that are lovely. But the subject matter of today's hearing is to get at the root cause and the root facts of an awful tragedy that occurred. The mismanagement, then the political cover-up that resulted from that mismanagement, and a rush to judgment by some very ambitious political operatives within Washington. At least that's near as what I can tell, having gotten into the facts as we have today and knowing what we know today. So I want to thank all three of you gentlemen for your service to the American people and to our government. And I want to say to you that the tough treatment you've gotten as a result, not only on that day in September, but since then, is a horrible tragedy. I want to go back to Mr. Gowdy's line of questions here. Mr. Hicks, was there a protocol within the consulate in the event of a protest?
Yes, there was.
Was there any evidence when you were there in Libya on that day that this was a protest?
No, there was none. And I'm confident that Ambassador Stevens would have reported a protest immediately if one appeared on his door. The protocol, of course, was for us to evacuate immediately from the consulate and move to the annex.
Okay. Was there anything in connection to a YouTube video? Was there any awareness that it was the events occurred because of a YouTube video?
The YouTube video was a non-event in Libya.
Okay. And did you know about that within a couple days or the day of?
Yes.
Okay. And so did you report to anyone in Washington within the first couple of days that there was anything in connection, a protest in connection to a YouTube video?
No, the only report that our mission made through every channel was that there had been an attack on a consulate.
Not a protest?
No protest.
You can leave your microphone off. I'm going to come back to you a few times. Mr. Gowdy mentioned this earlier, but on September 16th, Ambassador Susan Rice went on the Sunday shows, recited a whole group of talking points. Were you a part of those talking points?
No, I had no role in their preparation.
Okay. So 1 month later, we had an Undersecretary Kennedy. Let's play his statement.
Always made clear from the very beginning that we are giving out the best information we have at the time we are giving it out. That information has evolved over time. For example, if any administration official, including any career official, had been on television on Sunday, September 16th, they would have said the same thing that Ambassador Rice would have said. She had the information at that point from the intelligence community, and that is the same information I had, and I would have made exactly the same points. Clearly, we know more today, but we knew what we knew when we knew it.
By September 16th, did you know what you know, which is apparently what Susan Rice said? Let me rephrase that, actually. Let me actually make that a question, if you will. Ambassador Rice recited a set of facts
A month later, they defend it. The State Department defends that. You're a career State Department official. Would you have said the things that Ambassador Rice said?
Not after hearing what President Magariaf said, especially considering the fact that he had gone to Libya, to Benghazi himself at great personal and political risk. And for him to appear on world television and say this was a planned attack is by terrorists is phenomenal. I was jumping up and down when he said that. It was a gift for us from a policy perspective, from my perspective, sitting in Tripoli.
And did that occur before September 16th?
But he said that on the same talk shows with Ambassador Rice.
And did you report that? Was there knowledge that he was going to say that?
No, there was not.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I know we have a lot more questions about this, including what that did in country. Ambassador Rice's rhetoric, what that did and the impact it had in country for the work that you were doing and the delay that resulted because of that, of the FBI investigation on the ground. If you could speak to that, and Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me,
briefly.
And let him answer, please. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Again, it took 17, 18 days for us from that interview to get the FBI to Benghazi. And we dealt with people at a low level, and we got them to Benghazi by stringing together a series of basically low-level commitments to help us get them to Benghazi.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the families, again, of those who lost their lives in Benghazi, you have our condolences. And I think the best tribute we can give to those who've lost their lives is to make sure that we make sure this doesn't happen again. And I think that's really the goal of the committee. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Hicks, especially thank you for your extensive conversation about what happened during the confusion of those first hours, whether the ambassador was at the hospital or the annex and all that happened. I can tell you about 16 years ago, I was backpacking through the Darien Gap in Colombia and woke up to machine gun fire and hand grenades. And at the time, we didn't know what happened. We had paramilitaries on the river, we had guerrillas behind us, and we were caught in between. So I can fully understand the full confusion that happened at that time and your recanting of that, and I think we saw that in the report. What I can tell you, though, Mr. Chairman, is, I don't think there's a smoking gun today. I don't even think there's a lukewarm slingshot. What we have is some strong opinions from people who at least I know Mr. Nordstrom and Mr. Hicks both participated in the study, and Mr. Thompson, while he didn't, no one stopped him. No one said he shouldn't go in the study, but we've had a chance to take a look at this, and I think what's really imperative is that we make sure that these recommendations are done, that something concrete comes out of this so that no one else is in this situation. And I think one of the real things that we can do as a committee, as individuals on this committee, is to make sure that we provide adequate funding for security and training to all of our embassies. And I think, that I'm one of the new folks around here. So when I look at some of the past budgets where we've been asked for literally hundreds of millions of dollars that haven't been approved in a post 9/11 world, I look at that as rather risky. And both Mr. Nordstrom and Mr. Hicks, you both have extensive experience around the world and various places you've been. So looking at this proactively, I think this is probably the 9th or so hearing that the House has had on this issue. So maybe it's time we start looking at how we make sure we protect our embassies the very best way we can, rather than kind of going through and rehashing some of the same old stories. My question specifically for both Mr. Hicks and Mr. Nordstrom are, when it comes to extra training or extra security, do you feel that we need more in some of the embassies across the world, so that make sure that those who are working in there indeed have the very best protections, because we have that responsibility to them as they serve the country? Mr. Hicks?
Thank you. I think there are two things, and I appreciate the question. We in the State Department need more training for our people who are going to these critical threat posts, not only for our diplomatic security agents, but also for our everyday diplomats. We need to be able, in my opening statement, I talked about my experience in Bahrain of developing contacts who helped us get through some very difficult times in 2002 when our embassy was attacked twice, and we were experiencing very severe anti-American demonstrations. We have to be able to engage. Our diplomats have to be out on the street. One of the reasons why we were perhaps caught off guard in Benghazi is because, for security purposes, because we had so few personnel there, the consulate was basically on lockdown. And so it was very difficult for our principal officer to get out and mingle with the people and learn what was going on. This was magnified when I talked with a correspondent after the event who had been in Benghazi after 9/11, and the correspondent told me that the people of Benghazi were terrified by these Islamic extremist militias. We didn't have that sense prior to 9/11. And the only way we could have that sense is if we're out on the street. I think Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Sonnenschein, said it beautifully at the tribute for Ann Smedinghoff last week when she quoted correspondent Edward R. Murrow about going the last 3 feet. That's what we as diplomats do. So if we're going to be going outside the embassies to meet with people and learn what's going on, we have to have the training to be able to respond rapidly and effectively to a desperate situation. So that's one thing. The other thing I believe that we need to do, and I put this forth as part of my platform in running for office, in my speech to the Foreign Service, we need to develop a robust paradigm for analyzing and mitigating risk, and one that is comprehensible to every member of the Emergency Action Committee. And this would be a powerful tool for our regional security officers to be able to develop the kinds of programs and the kinds of activities that we need to mitigate risks that they identify through the use of this paradigm.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And I, too, agree with both sides of the aisle. This ought to continue with other hearings. And it was shocking to just hear a statement about this is rehashing same old stories. These aren't old stories. These aren't same old stories. This is a situation that is atrocious in that it happened. And it's about time we heard the stories for the first time that we're hearing today, and I thank the witnesses for being here to do that for us. And appreciate your valor, and appreciate the families and their sacrifice. Mr. Thompson, on several occasions already, it's been insinuated that not only did you not ask to be interviewed by ARB, but that you refused. You've indicated on a couple of occasions, no, you asked to be involved. Let me give you further opportunity and ask you, why were you concerned about the ARB's failure to interview you? And did you raise any concerns with the department about the review board's unwillingness to interview you?
The reason I was concerned about it was that it was a terrorist event, and we did not respond to a terrorist event with the team, or we weren't considered to, and there wasn't a normal process by which that goes through. That process that I've already stated is not one that is bureaucratic. It's one that can go from a cold start to wheels up, so to speak, within hours.
On-the-ground experience. Understanding of what you were tasked to do.
Yes, with respect to places like Nairobi, Kenya, on August 7th, 1998, in which we had 12 murdered Americans, 240 murdered Kenyans, and thousands injured. A very ambiguous situation, and a situation in which we responded to and collaborated with our DOD and our FBI colleagues. Even OFTA was there because we had to get Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. We even had to get them in there to help with the medical resupply because the hospitals were overrun by this event. We had to set up a new embassy because we had one that was destroyed. We had to set up all the communications for the ambassadors, so it was a fairly comprehensive response. Such was not the case in Tripoli with Mr. Hicks. However, we did have a need to get people pushed forward early. And even if they did not end up in Tripoli, they would be closer. Again, going back to the tyranny of distance, whether we would have landed in Frankfurt or Sigonella or Crete or somewhere in the area, those are the things I would have brought out to the board had I been interviewed.
Any of those findings included in the ARB report?
Not to my knowledge, but I also have not seen a classified version. They may be in there.
Mr. Hicks, in a little deference to my colleague from Ohio, I'd say on top of all of your distinguished records of achievement and accolades, your 2 earned degrees from University of Michigan are your best. And I appreciate that. Let me ask you this. Do you know if anyone interviewed by the ARB was provided an opportunity to read the full classified report?
I've talked to several witnesses who were interviewed by the ARB, and none of them have been allowed to read the classified report.
As far as you know, none that were interviewed have read the classified report?
So far as I know.
So you mentioned that there was a 2 a.m. phone call with the Secretary of State. During that short phone call, conversations you rehearsed for us, was there any mention of a demonstration during that conversation?
No.
It would be interesting to know if that was included in the report, but you've not read it. In fact, it wasn't. Do you think the ARB report lets any individual or bureaucracy off the hook?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, given the decision-making that Undersecretary Pat Kennedy was making with respect to Embassy, Tripoli, and Consulate Benghazi operations, he has to bear some responsibility.
What, in your view, were the shortcomings of the ARB process, besides not interviewing some people and allowing the classified report to be read?
Well, again, there was no stenographer in the room when we were interviewed.
No stenographer?
No, sir. And
so we're talking about editorial commentary potential as opposed to clear truth, accuracy?
That's correct. There were note takers. I had counsel in the room with me taking notes, but other witnesses did not have counsel or may not have had counsel.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I don't have that benefit on the campaign trail to not have accurate reporting. Thank you.
Well, it's Congress created the ARB in 1986, so we have the ability to professionalize it by congressional action. Perhaps that'll be something we'll recommend. We now go to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your bravery in being here today and for your service to our nation. I really believe that the best way to honor the sacrifice of Ambassador Stevens and the 3 other Americans who gave their lives in the line of duty in a final act of devotion to this nation, the best thing that we can do is to put aside politics and take a hard look at the facts of what went wrong and what we need to do as we move forward to make sure this never, ever happens again. And I share the frustration that many of my colleagues have expressed about the fact that we did not have the opportunity to properly prepare for your testimony today or to participate in a bipartisan investigation. I want to take a look particularly at what we can do to strengthen our missions, particularly in parts of the world where we cannot rely on host governments to provide
in that same role before. So if anybody should understand this, I would hope that he would. So that's why I'm going to the point of there's something apparently wrong with the process of how those security recommendations are raised to the Secretary.
I agree. I think that you've given us a great way forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady. We now go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for testifying today. Thank you for your service. Mr. Hicks from a Michigan alum, go blue. Mr. Hicks, you testified that you haven't read the final classified ARB report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If you haven't been allowed to read the report, how do you know whether your testimony was used appropriately?
I have no idea.
Have the the department employees who were singled out for disciplinary action, were they allowed to read the final classified ARB report to find out to examine the evidence that was used against them?
2 of those individuals have told me that they were not allowed to read the classified report.
Do you believe that the ARB report does enough to ensure that a similar tragedy doesn't take place in the future?
Again, I haven't read the complete report, so I can't make a judgment at this point in time.
Did you have an opportunity to provide input with respect to the report?
Yes, I had a 2-hour conversation with the board.
All right. I'm going to yield some time to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank you. Mr. Hicks, do we typically need permission of a host nation government to fly military aircraft over their territory?
Yes, we do.
And to your knowledge, did we ever ask the Libyans for permission to fly over their country?
Frequently.
But did we the night of the attack?
The night of the attack?
Once this incident started, did we seek permission from the Libyan government to do a flyover?
I think in the record there is a UAV was flying over Libya that night, and it had permission to be there.
Did we ever ask for permission to fly anything other than an unarmed drone over Libya during the attack?
No.
Would you have known that?
Yes.
Based on your extensive experience as a diplomat in dealing with the Libyan government, do you believe the Libyans would have granted overflight rights if we had requested it?
I believe they would have.
Mr. Nordstrom, do you believe that would also be true?
I think certainly in this situation, they were fairly,
Mr. Chairman, I think one of the unanswered questions here is if it's a possibility, if there's any chance that we could get military overflight, if we could get a military flight there, then we would ask permission in advance. My concern is there was never an intention. There was never an attempt to actually get these military aircraft over there. I think one of the hard questions we have to ask is not only about the tankers, but what was the NATO response? We flew for months over Libya. Months. We conducted an air campaign. And we have assets. We have NATO partners. We worked, for instance, with the Italians. It is stunning that our government, the power of the United States of America, couldn't get a tanker in the air. Mr. Hicks, when did you think that this was actually over? It was done. We were safe.
Not until our personnel landed in Tripoli on the C-130.
And then, even then, Ansar al-Sharia had posted that we were potentially, there's a reason why you had to leave the facility in Tripoli.
That's correct.
When did you actually return to the embassy in Tripoli?
We returned, I believe, on the 14th.
When did the FAST team arrive to help secure the embassy?
They arrived on the night of September 12th at about 8.
And there still was a potential fire.
but that's not really a place where we put recommendations. It's more laying out the situation, the crime, the political situation, and a lot of that reporting I had done previously with Washington.
And so they had recommendations from you, or not?
It's my understanding, yes. They had wanted a transition plan specifically on how we were going to transition from the SST and the DS agents to our local bodyguards. That was submitted to them February 15th.
And do you know, was that implementation plan accepted? Was it implemented?
I never really got any feedback from Washington. That was one of the things that surprised me even when I left post. I was never contacted by DS leadership or management from the date I left on the 26th to this date. The only time I had any interaction was preparing before the October hearings, but they've never contacted me to ask me on thoughts about Libya, suggestions, anything like that.
Mr. Hicks, do you know whether security recommendations were implemented? Were there security recommendations that were implemented?
John Martinek, the RRSO, came on board, and he was following up on many of the things that Eric was working on before to strengthen our security posture in Libya. After the attack, attacks, John and I worked on a list of physical security improvements that had to be made in Tripoli in order for us to remain there. And I cabled that list into the department after Congressman Chaffetz's visit. And I learned later that that cable was not well received by Washington leadership. To the ARB's credit, when they saw that cable, they sent it to Undersecretary Kennedy and insisted that every recommendation in that cable be implemented.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit. Mr. Hicks, are you aware of any efforts by department officials to limit department witnesses' access to information about the attack prior to their testimony before Congress?
I have never seen the classified ARB report. So the answer is, in my respect, yes.
Mr. Nordstrom, do you know whether the State Department consciously sought to limit your awareness of certain information prior to your testimony before this committee?
I'm not aware of that.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Nordstrom. I want to read you an excerpt from an email Ambassador Stevens sent to you and a colleague on July 5th, 2012. The email concerned a draft cable intended to request an extension of security personnel for the embassy, which was ultimately sent on July 9th. Now, the ambassador wrote, "Gentlemen, I have taken a close look at the cable and edited it down and rearranged some paragraphs. My intention was to give more focus to what we are doing to end our reliance on TDY support and to let the department figure out how to staff our needs. If it looks okay, please run it by DS and see if they want it front channel." Then, Mr. Nordstrom, can you briefly explain what Ambassador Stevens meant when he asked you to run it by DS and see if they wanted it front channel?
What he's referring to is the process by which we would send an official State Department cable. I had done that for prior requests, and it was my advice to the ambassador, I do remember that dialogue, that we do in fact send that front channel. Within the Department of State, that is considered to be the official record. If I sent something by email or informally discussed it by telephone, it's still valuable, but unless it's on that cable, it's not official. My experience in the past was that as soon as we put those recommendations, just as Greg just alluded to, as soon as we put that onto an official cable, somehow we were seen as embarrassing the Department of State because we are requiring them to live up to their end of the bargain.
Thank the gentlelady. We now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll add my thanks to the gentlemen on the panel. I know you've heard that over and over and over again from members here, but only because folks believe it. And we're grateful to you, not just for being here today, but for your decade upon decade of service. I'll tell you, Mr. Thompson, I'm comforted, and I know folks at U.S. posts across the world are comforted that there are men and women who do what you do, who live by a code that says if you're in harm's way, we're going to come for you. Just hang on. And I thank you very much for that commitment.
Thank you.
Mr. Nordstrom, my questions are following up on my colleague from Wyoming, thinking back to early July 2012. Do you recall your back and forth with Charlene Lamb, particularly?
Vividly.
What did you think of that decision-making process? Were those decisions that Ms. Lamb was making, or were those decisions being kicked up to a higher level?
It was unclear. I think largely Das Lamb, but one thing that struck me throughout the entire time that I was in Libya was a strange decision-making process. Specifically, again, the Undersecretary for Management in many ways was dealing directly with Das Lamb. As her supervisor 2 levels ahead, obviously he has that ability to do that. well when it's right. But it was strange that was that direct relationship, and I never really saw interaction from Assistant Secretary of DS, Art Boswell, or our director, Scott Boltramans. It was even more clear in October when we were all sitting up here. There was two levels, if you will, that were not reflected, and it was quite a jump between Daslam and Undersecretary Kennedy. So certainly I felt that anything that Daslam was deciding certainly had been run by Undersecretary Kennedy.
And given the seriousness of that conversation, thinking about extending SSD and MSD as the security support, did you receive an explanation for why that request was denied that satisfied you?
I didn't. As I testified before, what I perceived that it was some sort of explained to me that it would be somehow embarrassing or politically difficult for State Department to continue to rely on DOD, and that there was an element of that. That was never fully verbalized, but that was certainly the feeling that I got going away from those conversations.
And then following up on moving these discussions from back channel to front channel, what was the nature of your conversation with the ambassador, that this was such a serious issue that rather than leaving it with a no on back channels, he wanted to elevate that?
That's exactly what it is. In fact, I recall all the way back to our first meeting with Congressman Chaffetz and the chairman. That was the question that I think they posed to me is, well, if you knew she was going to keep saying no, why did you keep asking? Well, because it was the right thing to do, and it was the resources that were needed. And if people also on the other side felt that was the right thing to do, to say no to that, they could at least have the courtesy to put that in the official record.
And did you receive any feedback back from Washington, whether a direct response to that cable or a back channel response to the fact that you elevated it to this front channel process?
By the time that we sent the one in July, no, I did not receive a response. In fact, that cable, as I understand, was never responded to, which is something that is relatively unheard of in the State Department. When you send a request cable for anything, whether it's copiers or resource or manpower, they get back to you. Prior discussions, back channel ones, yes, I had a number of conversations with my regional director and also Das Lamb, where it was discouraging, to put it mildly. That why do you keep raising these issues? Why do you keep putting this forward?
And if you can characterize it then between a non-response or a disagreement when it comes to these issues of security for American personnel on the ground in Libya, were you receiving a non-response from Washington, or was there disagreement in Washington with your assessment of levels of need on the ground?
I largely get a non-response. The responses that I did get were, you don't have specific targeting, you don't have specific threats against you. The long and short of it is you're not dealing with suicide bombers, incoming artillery, and vehicle bombs like they are in Iraq and Afghanistan, so basically stop complaining.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you,
Is
Mr.
there anything else to answer? Okay, I thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know that it's been a long day and lots of questions and answers have been shared. But let me ask the gentleman this. Last week, an unidentified individual who was described as a military special ops member appeared on national television to give an interview on the military's response to the attacks in Benghazi. The man appeared behind a black screen in order to conceal his identity. He suggested that military assets in Europe could have prevented the second attack in Benghazi. Specifically, he said this: I know for a fact that C-110, the EUCOM, European Command, CIF Commanders and Extremist Force, was doing a training exercise not in the region of North Africa, but in Europe, and they had the ability to react and respond. He further stated, we had the ability to load out, get on birds, that is aircraft, and fly there at a minimum stage. C-110 had the ability to be there, in my opinion, in 4 to 6 hours. He then went on to conclude that they would have been there before the second attack. Let me ask if any of you gentlemen are familiar with this claim.
Yeah, I've seen. I saw it on television.
Yes.
All right. In order to investigate the claim, last week Ranking Member Cummings wrote a letter to Secretary Hagel asking for the Defense Department's response. We've now received that written response from the department, and I'd like to enter that letter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
When we have it, we'll take it under advisement. I haven't seen it yet.
In regards to the anonymous allegation that the CIF could have arrived in Benghazi prior to the initiation of the second attack on the annex, the time needed from alerting the CIF to landing at the Benghazi airport is greater than the approximately 7.5 hours between the initiation of the first attack and that of the second one. The letter also says this: the time requirements for notification, load, and transit alone prevented the CIF from being at the annex in time enough to change events. Does anyone disagree with that statement?
I think the only thing I would add to that, not being privy to the decisions on the ground on that day, what's valuable is none of us, including the committee, had those details but for that person coming forward and making that allegation. I think that's the point that minority Mr. Cummings made, is that it's important to get these questions raised in this format. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see those same kinds of allegations because people do not feel that the answers have been provided, or that those answers have been provided in a credible way. So I think it is much more important to get it done in this manner.
Thank you very much. The Defense Department's letter appears to be consistent with ARB report, which said this, and I quote, "The board found no evidence of any undue delays in decision-making or denial of support from Washington or from the military combatant commanders. Quite the contrary. The safe evacuation of all U.S. government personnel from Benghazi 12 hours after the initial attack and subsequently to Ramstein Air Force Base was the result of exceptional U.S. government coordination and military response and helped save the lives of 2 severely wounded Americans." So I don't know who that unidentified individual was on Fox News, but according to the Defense Department, his claim is incorrect. And so, Mr. Chairman, I simply wanted to get that into the record. And thank you very much.
Will the gentleman kneel? Will the gentleman kneel?
Yes.
Will the gentleman kneel?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Believe you yield to me,
I'm
correct?
yielding to Mr. Maloney.
Thank you very much. By all accounts, Ambassador Stevens was a remarkable man, and I wonder, was he aware how dangerous it was in Benghazi? And Mr. Hicks, were you aware how dangerous it was, yet he still made the decision to go there? Is that correct?
Gentleman's time has expired. You may answer.
Yes, the ambassador was very well aware of the security situation in Benghazi. Before he went, we had the chance to outbrief Eric Gaudiosi, the departing principal officer.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding these hearings. Mr. Chairman, it's been said that all that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. But I submit to you, we have 3 very good men here who are going beyond the call of duty to come here and testify today. They have my commitment to protect them from any retribution that may come from this. And I get the sense that there may be other people listening to these testimony today that have answers that we don't have yet. And I would encourage them to come forward as well. We've got a lot of good answers today thanks to these witnesses. I'd like to start with Mr. Thompson. I'm struck by your long and distinguished career of hostage rescue missions, and some of these missions are still classified but were successful. Can you remind us where you were when these events began to unfold?
At my desk in the State Department.
So you were at your desk at the State Department, and you asked to marshal the resources and the team to help with the rescue effort, defense effort, did you not?
Yes, my first call was to the National Security Council, our CT contacts there.
And they, in your testimony, you stated that you were told this was not the right time. Is that correct?
When I referred that question to the Undersecretary for Management's office, yes.
Okay. If this wasn't the right time, when would be the right time? Because this is the source of frustration that the American public has, that I have. We're the greatest country in the world, and we left people there, Mr. Hicks and Mr. Stevens, to essentially defend for themselves. And when we had these resources, when would be the right time if this weren't the right time?
There's no answer to that, sir.
Well, staying on that topic of time, would it have been a reasonable thing in an uncertain situation such as this crisis where we don't know how it's going to unfold to go ahead and assemble that team and put them on a plane? Was there sufficient communications on a plane that you could have pulled back a mission that was ready to deploy?
We practice this at least twice a year, as in a complete deployment to a overseas location to work with our interagency partners. And the team, obviously, again, is staffed with interagency CT professionals. The answer to your question is yes, that plane, which is funded by DOD, has a robust communication suite. The senior communicator on there works for me, and he's very competent at his job.
Are you convinced, I know you haven't been allowed to review or even contribute to the Accountability Review Board's report, but are you convinced that the changes have been made so that this won't happen again for another embassy?
No.
Okay, that's troubling to me, and I appreciate your candor. Mr. Hicks, you mentioned that at 2 a.m. you had a phone conversation with Mrs. Secretary Clinton. Is that correct?
Yes.
At any time during that conversation, did she ask what resources you might be able to use or might need?
Yes, she did. I asked for security reinforcements and transport aircraft to move our wounded out of the country to medical facility.
Was there any indication that you would receive air support?
She indicated that the Marine Fast Team was being deployed to bolster our security posture in Tripoli, and that a C-17 would be coming down to take people back.
But no immediate military response?
But the Marines were on their way, and they would be arriving on the 12th.
Okay. Did you tell the Accountability Review Board about Secretary Clinton's interest in establishing a permanent presence in Benghazi? Because ostensibly, wasn't that the reason that the ambassador was going to Benghazi?
Yes, I did tell the Accountability Review Board that Secretary Clinton wanted the post made permanent. Ambassador Pickering was surprised. He looked both ways to the members of the board, saying, does the 7th floor know about this? And another factor in Chris's decision was our understanding that Secretary Clinton intended to visit Tripoli in December.
Pickering was surprised that his mission was to establish a permanent facility there.
Yes.
That's your impression?
Yes.
Okay. I thank you for your time. I thank the witnesses.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield.
just want you to say it unambiguously, if that's the correct way to say it without a flaw. One more time. The reason the ambassador was in Benghazi, at least one of the reasons, was X.
At least one of the reasons he was in Benghazi was to further the Secretary's wish that that post become a permanent constituent post, and also there because we understood that the Secretary intended to visit Tripoli later in the year. We hoped that she would be able to announce to the Libyan people our establishment of a permanent constituent post in Benghazi at that time.
Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield?
Thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you, Mr.
We now go to the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thanks for being here today. And it's been a long day, and I think there's been some interesting things said, and there's been a lot of questions. One of the things that was said earlier today that sort of concerns me a little bit, it says that these hearings have not found a smoking gun, or I believe it's even a warm slingshot. Well, I, for one, and the folks of the 9th District of Georgia, where I represent, are not looking for those things. They're looking for the truth. They're looking for what happened that night. Because the one thing we have found, it may not be a smoking gun or a warm slingshot, but we have 4 dead Americans. And that's what this is about. That's about finding what happened in the past so that we can move forward in the future. And I appreciate your willingness to be here and these families who are willing to do this, because truth is important, even in this town. It's important. I want to ask a follow-up question. Mr. Nordstrom, I want to follow up on a question from Mr. Langford earlier about a March 28th cable asking for more security. He asked you about your intended recipients of that cable. Now, did you expect Secretary Clinton to either have read or to be briefed about that cable?
Absolutely. I certainly expected, given the fact that she had an involvement in the security process, if I could take a step back, by virtue of having the SST teams there, because they were a Department of Defense asset, the process required for that is something called an exec sec. That exec sec is literally a request from one cabinet head to another, in this case, state to DOD. That request must be signed by the cabinet head, Secretary Clinton. She would have done that, the initial deployment request, plus an extension in the fall, and a second extension in February. She also came out to post, toured our facilities, and saw the lack of security there. That was something that her country team, or she was briefed by the country team as she visited the site. We also saw later there was the attacks against the facility. Certainly there's a reasonable expectation that her staff would have briefed her on those points.
I think it was you that said earlier, could this be a concern about a DOD presence and an embarrassment with state on a embassy? And a real short answer there.
That was how I took away.
That's why you took it,
right from Dasland.
Thank you, Mr. Hicks. I have a question. We'll go back. It's been asked here a little bit before. In discussions about a permanent presence in Benghazi, give me sort of a quick flavor of what was those discussions like. Was it said you do this? How was it going out?
Chris told me that in his exit interview with the secretary after he was sworn in, the secretary said, "We need to make Benghazi a permanent post."
Okay.
And Chris said, "I'll make it happen."
Okay. Was Washington informed of the ambassador's plan to travel to Benghazi?
Yes, Washington was fully informed that the ambassador was going to Benghazi, and we advised them August 22nd or thereabouts.
Okay. Were there any concerns raised from that?
No. In fact,
given the timing and everything.
None.
Okay. Based on your experiences in Libya, do you believe that foreign service officers remain in avoidable danger in such high threat countries as Libya?
Thanks. I believe that foreign service officers are serving their country where they need to be serving their country. And in some places, the risk that they are taking is very high.
But could we, in light of what we're seeing now, be avoidable in the sense of from our lessons learned, if you would?
From a lessons learned standpoint, the security, we need to be increasing our security strength and practices and training. And so, again, I may not be quite understanding the question.
Well, and I think what I'm saying is that what, if you had that situation, what needs to be done to prevent something like this from happening again? Is that being taken advantage of, or is there still sort of a denial process going on here?
I think that we have more to do than what has been put forth by the ARB and its recommendations.
Okay. So as we move along, and I want to maybe ask you this question that I asked earlier, especially from a security standpoint, because it's something I think that we can flesh out over time, and maybe Ms. Thompson, if you want to jump in on this, is that DOD sort of influence that has been mentioned by Mr. Norris a couple of times, from the wanting to be permanent in the area. Was that an embarrassment figure? Did you get that sense as well that we're trying to do this on our own? And Mr. Hicks, I'd like to hear you answer that as well.
I never got that sense.
That was more Ms. Nordstrom. You did have that sense, though.
Again, that was specifically conveyed by the by Das Lamb to both me and to the prior DCM.
Ms. Thompson, anything to add there?
Nothing in the context of
Good. Well, I do appreciate it. And again, like I said, this is an issue of truth. You've been providing that. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Meadows, as I yield to you, would you mind giving me about 10 seconds back?
I'll yield to the chairman.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Mr. Hicks, Colonel Wood in the previous hearing with Mr. Nordstrom testified about trips back and forth of these people, these military people, like the 4 that were told not to get on the plane, himself included. During your time as Deputy Chief of Mission, did those 4 men doing training ever go to Benghazi?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank each of you for being here all day today. And certainly, as Mr. Nordstrom started out this, you let us know clearly that this is not about politics, it's about people. And I just say thank you for that, because that's what it is. And to the families, I want to let you know that the people back home are standing with you. We had unbelievable questions that I'll submit to you that we won't cover today in terms of asking them, that we'll submit to you for you to answer, but they're standing with you to get to the truth of this, and they will not sit down until those questions have been answered. And I thank the chairman for this informative hearing. Mr. Thompson, let me go. You had talked earlier about the deployment of the FEST team, and you said that you thought it was important to do that. Were there any other agencies that thought that other than you, that thought that was important?
Yes, Federal Bureau of Investigation and DOD specifically, our SOCOM friends.
So you're saying that it wasn't just you, but the DOD, so outside the State Department, the DOD and the FBI both felt like that was the appropriate response to make sure that we provide that kind of forces.
People who are part of the team, a normal part of that team that deploy with us, were shocked and amazed that they were not being called on their cell phones, beepers, etc. to go. Whether or not that view was shared by very senior people in those institutions, I do not know.
All right, but the DOD and FBI had a contradictory response to what the State Department's ultimate decision was to deploy.
Well, again, the State Department doesn't make that decision. The National Security Council Deputies Committee authorizes the deployment. So I think what transpired was a strong enough conversation from our department reps that they were convinced that was not the thing to do.
All right, Mr. Nordstrom, and let me go back to the ARB, because everybody talks about how wonderful this process was. What I see it as narrow in scope, incomplete in its nature, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but earlier you talked about the ARB fixed blame, I think you said, on mid-level, or those career employees, not those at a senior level or the political appointments. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, and did you not say that that's where the decisions are made, at that senior level?
That's correct. Ambassador Pickering asserted that it was made at the assistant secretary level and below. That's at variance with what I've personally seen.
So you personally believe that the decisions are made at a much higher level, and I see, Mr. Hicks, you're nodding your head yes. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
So the ARB, in looking to place blame on those career employees, ignored a whole lot of what you would say the decision makers in terms of assigning blame. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
So both of you agree with that. All right, let me go on a little bit further, Mr. Nordstrom. One last question, and then I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Utah. As we look at this, is it fair that all the blame got assigned to the diplomatic security component? Aren't they just one component underneath the Management Bureau? Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. I don't believe it is fair. As I said, I think that certainly those resource determinations are made by the Undersecretary for Management.
And so as we look at that, when we start assigning blame, it's the ARB was incomplete in their analysis in terms of who was to blame for that with regards to an agency. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, you fixed blame for the 3 people underneath the Undersecretary for Management, but nothing to him. So that either means he didn't know what was going on with his subordinates, or he did and didn't care.
All right, and there's some critical questions. I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Utah.
Yield to the gentleman from South Carolina.
Yeah, I'll be glad to yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina. I know I don't have much time, but Mr. Hicks, I want to set the table for the next round. September the 12th, 2012, did you receive an email from Beth Jones there that also copied Victoria Newland, William Burns, Patrick Kennedy, and Cheryl Mills? You're also on the distribution list. Do you recall receiving that email?
Sorry, which email?
Well,
at that time I was receiving a couple hundred a day.
And that's fair, and you had other things on your mind on September 12th. This one said, when he said his government suspected that former Gaddafi regime elements carried out the attacks, I told him that the group that conducted the attacks, Ansar al-Sharia, is affiliated with Islamic extremists. Do you recall that email?
I do believe I recall that email.
Okay, we'll now go to the gentleman from Michigan, who may want to yield more time to the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As a veteran of Vietnam and Iraq, I understand that the boots on the ground are the closest to the truth in these situations. You know more about what happened in Benghazi than any bureaucrat or politician can. The fog of battle is easily blamed when mistakes are made at the highest level. Being caught between the political dictates of superiors and the chain of command and doing what is necessary to protect our citizens abroad is difficult. I understand the risk you've taken by showing up here today as well. Thank you for having the courage to testify before us. We are counting on you to reveal the truth about the failures of this government and to protect the men and women who served in Libya and how we can do a better job in the future. Mr. Thompson, earlier you mentioned that you hang out with some brave and honorable group. Are they Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, or shallow water sailors?
All the above.
All the above. Can you tell me, according to recent...
I might add, sir,
Yes, sir.
from the other agencies of government too, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Intelligence Community, Department of Energy, Diplomatic Security is on the team.
And this is part of your special security force or
no,
team?
this is the interagency component of the Foreign Emergency Support Team.
They all highly trained?
Very much so.
SWAT?
Well, we are not the operators. We are the facilitators and the people that bring the operation and coordinate all aspects of a response. So we're not the door kickers, is the some term of art these days. We are not door kickers.
Okay. So, but you share a common ethos, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely.
Never leave anyone behind. Always watch your buddies 6 o'clock and lead by example. Was that a safe thing to say?
That would be a great summary.
Great. So, according to recent media reports, at least 15 special operators and highly skilled State Department security staff were available in Tripoli, but were not dispatched to aid Americans under attack in Benghazi. Why were these personnel not deployed to rescue the Americans in Benghazi?
I cannot answer that. I was not on the ground.
Mr. Hicks?
It's yes.
I'm not sure that number is accurate. We did deploy people to Benghazi. The first team went with 7 members at midnight. The second team left at about 6:30 or 7 a.m. that morning. We could not deploy all of our security personnel because we still had about 55 diplomatic personnel in Tripoli that were under threat for attack.
Thank you very much, and I yield the rest of my time to the gentleman, Mr. Gowdy.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Hicks, all right, we're going back to that email. You're on the distribution, and just so it's clear, Mr. Chairman, nothing would thrill me more than to release this email, and it's certainly not classified. We all had access to it. All you had to do was go downstairs in the basement and